Welcome to the Excellence in Training Academy, where trainers come to grow at excellenceintrainingacademy.com. I'm very pleased to have with us this week Javi Miller Estrada. Javi is a sport movement specialist and the co-founder of Ignite Performance in Chandler, Arizona. In just under 5 years, Ignite has become one of the premier training facilities for long-term athletic development. They take a holistic approach to training and believe that being a great athlete extends far beyond the weight room. Ignite works with athletes from youth to professional levels and specializes in working with high school athletes. As a team, they have helped over 100 athletes obtain college scholarships. Javi is also the host of the Athlete Blueprint podcast, a great podcast where he, along with his world-class guests, discuss topics in skill acquisition, sports psychology, and injury rehabilitation. For the last several years, Javi has dedicated himself to deeply investigating human movement and believes that taking a more modern approach to skill development leads to more effective outcomes and greater transfer to sport. So, Javi, welcome to the Excellence in Training Academy.
Brian, thanks so much for having me. Super excited to talk with you today.
Now, I first got exposed to you. I saw you pop up on a lot of the emergence things and some of the sport movement skill conferences, and then you presented at the 2021 Sport Movement Skill Conference. And then I looked up your podcast and I've listened to a number of episodes of the podcast. And I reached out to you to see if you would be willing to talk about a subject that I know is very near and dear to your heart, and it's this return to sport or return to play, and in our case, return to work, and how we need to think differently about that whole concept. Now, one of the things that we didn't mention in your bio is that you have a physical therapy background. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Yes, of course. And I think I'll start my experience as an athlete as well, because I think that has helped informed and shape my current form of life. But, I was that typical athlete who had a lot of injuries. There's a lot of stories like that, but I experienced firsthand the shortcomings of traditional physiotherapy, physical therapy, rehabilitation. Looking back on that experience, I didn't really adapt to my new set of constraints, right? Becoming injured and then trying to reintegrate back into sport is a difficult process. And I just feel like I was never the same, right? My confidence, right? A lot of the focus is so much on biomechanics and limb symmetry and things like that, but my confidence wasn't there. So I experienced that firsthand and didn't necessarily have the care that I would provide to someone now. So as an athlete, I was on one side of it, going in and out of PT for about 4 or 5 straight years with knee injuries, shoulder injuries, ankle injuries, you name it, I did it. And then working in that environment, right? I knew that I was drawn towards that there was a calling there, that if I can help athletes in this process and lend my perspective, then maybe I can help that experience become better for them. So I worked in physical therapy clinics, primarily working alongside the physical therapists, and then eventually started training, obtained my CSCS and started training athletes or patients that were coming off from PT to now reintegrating into their life, into their sport, whatever it may be. And I noticed that there was this gap, right? There's this gap between I'm clear from physical therapy, the doctor, the physical therapist, the physiotherapist, whatever, says I'm clear to go, ready to go, and then actually performing. And that gap is where a lot of my interest is, because I feel like as an industry as a whole, it's not being addressed in a way that I think truly facilitates skill development for that athlete, that worker, whatever they may be. It's left a lot of it to chance, where athletes are just expected to somehow go from working in a constrained environment of physical therapy to, in this case, in a lot of the examples here, to a workplace, which is not always friendly, which is not always easy, and which is not always the same. So that's where my interest in physical therapy and that return to play process, and just really investigating as a profession, as an industry, how we can better bridge that gap to have better outcomes for our athletes.
And talking about bridging that gap, one of the things I've heard you talk about is some of the statistics and the data on the prevalence of re-injury of, say, ACL injuries. So I blew out my ACL as an adult. So my injuries were all as an adult when I was a law enforcement officer. Can you talk about the prevalence of re-injury of that? Because I think that's something that doesn't get talked about a lot. People see it once in a while, where you'll see an athlete that gets hurt, comes back, gets hurt again. But can you just talk about the prevalence of, based on the current model, the way that we treat the rehab and the return to play, how it might lead to some of this prevalence of re-injury?
Mm-hmm. And when we're talking about this prevalence, I think everything needs to be looked at through the lens of trying to treat each athlete as an individual, each athlete, each person, each subject as their own unique entity. And I think that's where one of the issues are. If you look at the protocols, they're protocols, right? They're linear protocols. But we understand that athletes don't develop and don't recover in a linear fashion. So I think that's one thing that I just want to highlight, because I think it leads to certain issues, right? We expect an athlete to hit these timelines. And I think they do have a place, because we do want to have, goals. We do want to have markers, but we need to understand that every athlete develops, and in this case, recovers differently. So oftentimes you see is a re-injury rate that is relatively high. I've seen as high as like 30% re-injury rate, whether it's the same side or it's a different side. And you would think, with all the development in surgical technologies, all the development in skilled professionals that we have doing some of these surgeries, that we've largely eliminated that. But that doesn't seem to be the case. So when you look at it further, if an athlete has the same limb symmetry, right, their dominant limb and non-dominant limb, or affected side and non-affected side, are pretty close by. They've passed all these tests, which, by the way, these agility tests, I use that with air quotes, are usually done in a rote, repetitious, repeat the same thing over and over again, right? How perfect can things look? If we've made strides in that, if we have these perfect protocols, these great surgical designs and implementations, then why are athletes still getting hurt? Why are they still re-injuring their knee? And to me, there's something deeper there that needs to be investigated. Because if you think about, as an athlete returns to sport, let's just take the example, they go to physiotherapy, and maybe they're a rugby player or a football player or a field sport player, and they go through their rehab. They may never get back onto the pitch or the field until the practice setting, right? And so then who's in charge of making sure that that athlete's movement system isn't overwhelmed, that they adapt and, become skillful again, right? Under the new set of constraints. There's not really someone that is necessarily in charge of that. And that's where I think, for me, where I would like to help facilitate that, right? As a sport movement specialist, help facilitate that athlete's reintegration into their sport.
And I know that you look at this as a team approach, and it seems to me that that's one of the issues that we currently face, is that we have all these silos, and the people are very skilled, and everybody's well-intentioned, but the surgeons are super busy. I get in eventually to see a surgeon. They say, okay, here's the deal. Here's your surgical date. I see them briefly before the surgery, maybe briefly after the surgery. Then I have a few other visits. Then I go to a physical therapist. They're slammed, so I'm not the only person they're dealing with. They're running from patient to patient to patient in very confined spaces, and so they have limitations. And then I might go back to work or go back to the sport. The coaches are well-intentioned, but that's not their area of expertise. And I know that you take the look at this as a team approach and a holistic approach, that when you're working with an athlete coming back from an injury, you're in constant contact with their physical therapist to try and create this team environment. Is that a shift that we need to make, where we think about that we're all in this together to best serve the athlete or the tactical athlete or whoever it is that is the person coming back from injury?
100%. And I think silos is the right term. Oftentimes it becomes where I do my job, but then I don't know what the next step is, or I do my job and I don't have any communication. And if I'm working with an athlete that is a post-op, return to play, it should be incumbent upon me and the physical therapist to establish some sort of communication, so I can better understand what those first few months of their rehab process was like. At the beginning of the rehab process, I'm going to be largely out of the picture, and that's fine. But as that progression happens, that pie looks a little bit different, right? The slice of the pie that I take up is going to be a little bit bigger, right? And then I need to then communicate with their coach to let them know what I see, to let them know what we're doing. Because otherwise, that athlete has to then really advocate for themselves. And that athlete, whether they're, maybe don't have the knowledge, or whether they're just, young, it's a youth athlete, or whether they just don't necessarily know that they can do that, someone has to be the advocate for that athlete. And in the case of like a tactical athlete, I mean, I'm sure a tactical athlete wants to get to their job as soon as possible, right? So they're focused on that. So someone needs to be worried about making sure that that athlete is guided and that communication is transitioned. And I do want to add on to something as well. I think that there are limitations for physical therapists. Like, I don't want to pretend that there's not. Right. I mean, if you look at the American insurance system, the current model, it's pretty difficult for an outpatient physical therapist to spend the adequate time that would be ideal. Right. It's just impossible. You have to make money. You have to operate a business. But I think there is a role there. Right. And Sean Mishka has talked about the role of a sport movement specialist, someone to help that athlete acquire or reintegrate, readapt their skill. And so that's where I think the communication piece can fall a little bit short. And if we all think about the athlete first, that's one of the things we talk about at Ignite, putting the athlete first. If we put the athlete first, drop everything else, including the ego, then we can help have a better outcome.
Absolutely. And I think that's such a critical piece is that, sometimes, so, I mean, most law enforcement agencies and public service agencies are short-staffed. So if I'm rehabbing from this injury, if I'm taking what other people perceive to be too long, then there's this perception that I'm a malingerer. And so I don't want to leave people shorthanded. So I'm looking to get back as soon as possible and probably sooner than I should, and with a greater likelihood of creating that injury. Now, at Ignite, you have a 5,000 square foot facility. You have a 40-yard long, 10 yards wide turf area. You have a weight room. You have a lot of different things. Can you talk about some of the things? So first of all, at what point in the rehab? So if I'm coming back, say, from an ACL repair, at what point in the rehab would you ideally like to get involved? And then what are some of the things that you would do with athletes to help along this journey to best prepare them to return to play without getting re-injured within the first 20 exposures?
So I think, when we think about the return to play space, a lot of it we'll talk about around that 5-6 month mark when they start to do more sport related activities. However, I think there is room to integrate that much sooner. And I'll talk about what I mean here. One of the concepts that we like to do at Ignite, and we like to do especially with our, return to play athletes, and I would do the same approach with a tactical athlete, is this idea of repetition without repetition. And that is essentially meaning that you can change the constraints, you can change the task constraints a little bit, and the athlete can still solve the problem. Now, we can take that idea as complicated as, some agility activity that we set up, but we can also take it in a strengthening context. So if I was a PT working with an athlete and we were working on, say, a step up, for example, we always do a step up from the same box height, right? If you look at a flow sheet, unlike most physical therapy clinics, most physical therapists, it's the same few exercises done every time. Right. Every time and maybe every couple of weeks, they'll bump it up. What I'm saying is you can have repetition without repetition with something like a step up. You can have them step up from the side. And I understand there's certain restrictions with rotational aspects, but if that's the case, well, then maybe don't do rotation. You can do a lateral step up. You can have them step up and go down at a different speed. You can have a load where they're holding a dumbbell down at their waist, maybe here, maybe overhead. So then that athlete has to adapt and then solve that problem under slightly different task constraints. And that doesn't mean, like, that takes no space, Brian. Like, that doesn't, mean you have to have a 5,000 square foot, a gym to do that. So I think that there's meat on the bone for physical therapists to do things like that. It could also be as simple as having your athlete do a warm up with the implement, right? So if they play football, I try to get the guy we talked about off air, the case study, I tried to make sure that he would do his movement prep with the football. He hadn't touched a football in months. So why not allow him to feel what it feels like, again, to hold a football? A lacrosse player holding a PVC pipe, you could have him do the warm up with that, because running linearly, if you can only work on linear sprints, it's going to look a whole lot different holding a stick than it is running with your hands free. So, typically I'll get involved anywhere from like 4 to 6 months, but I think the involvement, or at least a philosophy shift, can start much sooner.
And the key with starting sooner and even at that 4 to 6 months is dealing with somebody like yourself that understands scalability. So,
Yes.
can you talk a little bit about the importance of that scaling the representative design, that you're not just thrusting them into game-like conditions right off the bat? You're looking at this as a long-term project and starting to slowly build some of these elements.
I'm so glad you brought that up, because people are probably would have probably thought, hey, you're just throwing them back into chaos. And that's not the case. But what I do want to highlight is that if you think about, we call it like a level of representativeness. If you think about the most representative thing that that the athlete could do is like the full-fledged version of their environment. So for maybe a police officer, it's in the field when, it hits the fan, when things are going nuts, right?
Yep.
And then you have the least representative possible environment, and that may be an environment that's devoid of any of that information, that is sterile, right? It's not an alive movement problem. It's not an alive environment. It looks nothing like the sport that or the task that they're going to have to do. What we can do is scale that bandwidth. We don't have to be 10. But the problem that I have is people go from ones and twos doing activities around dancing around cones and speed ladders and doing linear exercises and progressions to a level 10. And what I want to do is help scale that, surf that bandwidth. So we may never get in our setting to a 10, but can I get it to a 6 or a 7? So to answer the question about scaling, we can reduce task complexity. We can change the constraints. So we reduce some of we bring that number down, right? It's not as chaotic. So that could be as simple as the example that, that I did in that case study. It could be a simple 1v1, right, that we did for this football player, to give the audience some context, where he is trying to essentially score. It could be a 1v1 where I reduce the size of the playing surface, right? Because that's going to constrain him more. It's going to reduce velocity, right? If we're worried about him making a high speed cut. And also the other thing is, it's me, right? The audience may not be able to tell, but I'm not a college football player. I'm not 6'4", 300 pounds. So the opponent, right, is scaled as well. It's not as representative as if he were to face someone who's looks the part of a professional or college athlete. So there's definitely ways to bring it down to where you can still operate within your framework and not get to that chaotic point. In fact, we don't want to do that. That's not what we want to do. And I think that's a large misconception about some of these approaches. You can add in what Tyler Yerby would say, and what I've said many times as well, is slices of the game, or maybe for tactical athletes, slices of the environment, slices of work into a setting, so that way that athlete can adapt to that rather than just going into a chaotic situation.
And a lot of what you do, and to make it representative and to bring some aliveness to the training, is it's with another person, as opposed to, and again, physios have limitations in space and what they can do, but they might do things like agility ladders, or have me run towards a cone and shuffle one way or the other. But when I'm doing an agility ladder, my eyes are down, whereas an athlete, they need their eyes up. Tactical athlete need their eyes up, and we need to have the ability to read off of other people. So that's a lot of what you're doing when you talk about the 1 versus 1. Now, again, you're not going full speed where you're trying to rock them, but you're slowly building some of that speed and that intensity. And like you said, by limiting the space that you're working in, you can limit the speed that they're able to generate at any given point. So can you talk about the importance of that, working with somebody else?
Absolutely. I think, you've queued me up for a nice speed ladder rant, but which is always fun. So the issue with things like that is, number one, right? It's not an alive movement problem. It's sterile. It's dead. It's not changing, right? You're adjusting your movements to a cone that isn't moving at all. The speed ladder in particular, your eyes are down. So when we talk about movement, human movement, a lot of it's going to be centered around perception, what we perceive, not just visual perception, but also auditory, also haptic. So let me take a quick left turn here. But an example that we might do with someone who's coming off of an injury, we don't even have to necessarily do like he has the ball and tries to juke me. We might just like jockey for position. We might do a little bit of leverage, so expose them to a little bit of contact. So we might do a little game where we're just trying to bump each other out of the square, but not at full speed. We might do a little game where we try to do tag, where I'm trying to tag his shoulders because he's now has to perceive someone reaching for him and then adjust his body position. Or we could take it lower. We might do like a knee tag or anything like that. So there's plenty of ways to add in other areas of layers of perception. You could even do, one thing we would do a lot of the times is for this particular athlete as a tight end, he has to make contested catches. So instead of just doing landings and perfect, isolation all the time, I would have him jump, catch a ball, and I would get near him because that's a different strategy, right? To avoiding landing somebody, or I might push him. So that's just something that I wanted to add in there. But in regards to I believe your original question was centered around perception, right? I kind of lost it a little bit.
Yeah, the importance of having another person. So we're perceiving that piece of the environment of that perception action coupling.
Yes, exactly. And I think what we need to understand is that our movements are based off of perception. So often we train these things in isolation, right? We might train a move in isolation, but that doesn't tell us how and when to utilize that move. When are we making the decision to utilize the move? I think we far often separate the athlete and the environment. And if your environment is in opposition to other people, then shouldn't we, train in a way that is staying true to that environment? And so that's the issue, is that we may do things that are done without any of the noise, if you will, that's in an environment. Like, people want to separate the athlete and the noise. But what we need to realize is that noise is part of the problem. So the stuff that people traditionally try to shield you from, you're going to face it. So why not turn that noise up a little bit, so that way you can adapt to that, and then you can be more used to that rather than just facing it for the first time back in the job on day one.
And as part of that, getting them to sort through the signal versus noise, so that there's things that they can tune out, that they learn to educate their attention, what to be attuned to in the environment that they're going to function in, and then what they can tune out.
Absolutely. And that's where, as a coach, you can guide their attentions and intentions on what affordances, what opportunities for action to pick up, because not everything is going to be relevant for that athlete. And so you can help curate that through your environmental design, through your words acting as a constraint, right? To maybe guide the athlete's intentions to solve a problem a certain way. I think the key with that is we want to avoid telling the athlete exactly how to solve said problem. We ideally want them to solve it themselves under their own set of constraints, right? Each athlete is going to be different. And I think to expect, me to solve a problem the same way you do is a little ridiculous. So I do think it is important to kind of cue them in on what to look for, but not necessarily tell them exactly how to act.
Absolutely. And I think that's a piece that we forget, is that the individual. So, how I might solve a problem when I was brand new as a law enforcement officer at 22 was different than at 32, especially, and different at 32 prior to my knee injury, different than 35 post knee injury, different from now 65. And so if we're trying to force everybody into this same box, then it seems to me that we're going to run into issues with that. And if we're also trying to force people into the perfect movement box, then it seems that's an issue as well. Can you talk about that?
Absolutely. So first off, I don't believe you. I don't think you're 65. I think you're lying to everybody. But anyway, so to answer the question, I think we have to understand that there is a different set of individual constraints, right? And it's not just athlete dependent, it's frame dependent. So meaning, like, the constraints are going to be different from moment to moment. Fatigue levels change. Like, I think about your environment and tactical athletes, and nighttime versus daytime. The roads, right? That's going to be an environmental constraint. Whether it's raining, we don't get much rain here, but I'm sure you guys do. So I think it's important to understand the environment and the individual, because each athlete is going to go about it and solve the problem slightly differently, right? We think about like lived history. Take your knee injury, for example, right? That might affect how you go about solving a problem. You, in your current form of life versus when you were 25, has some different individual constraints. So why would we expect you to solve a problem that way? really, I think like the move needs to be made away from thinking of this as like rehabilitation. Like we're going to get to that same point. That's not necessarily the case, but we're going to adapt. So like Rob Gray will talk about skill adaptation, right? As like the idea, rather than this becoming the same self. You're becoming a different version of yourself, if that makes sense, right? You're adapting to your new set of task constraints rather than just trying to repeat what old Brian did back in the day, you know?
Absolutely. And so talk a little bit about the importance of, in starting to integrate some of the equipment pieces as well. So for, say, that football player, it's far different his visual field when he's wearing a helmet versus no helmet. You talked about having him carry a football. He was an offensive player. He was a tight end. So he's going to be in possession of the football. But you also made a comment in, I think, your presentation at the Sport Movement Skill Conference about that he mentioned to you one day the first time he put his cleats on, that'd been the first time he'd had those on since he injured himself. So can you talk about that piece as well to start to integrate some of the equipment that is going to be normal? And again, for a law enforcement professional, they're going to be wearing, 20 to 30 pounds worth of gear, just an average patrol officer. And then depending on what it is, they might be involved in other things where they're carrying other equipment as well. So can you talk about starting to integrate some of the equipment into that process?
I think that's a huge and really one of the most under discussed part of rehabilitation is just really understanding that the equipment that athlete uses, they have to now learn to, be functional with that equipment, right? They have to kind of relearn that. And I think as a practitioner, it's important to think about putting yourself in the athlete's shoes. Think about putting yourself in the athlete's life. And it's impossible to fully understand that. So that's why communication is important, to really understand what that athlete needs to do and what is required of them. With equipment, taking the example of the football player with the cleats, he hadn't worn those cleats since he last tore his ACL. That's something that I didn't even consider, right? And I'm fairly well versed in this school of thought. So to think about how that might affect his movements, his anxiety, his stress levels, we could take that same idea to someone getting back in the field. If they haven't worn that equipment for that first time and they're getting a little bit more fatigued because they're not used to that, how is that going to affect that first time they have to chase down somebody, or they have someone that attacks them and they have to grapple and defend themselves for their life, or carry someone out who's been injured or something like that. So I think it's very important that we not only develop skill in the environment, but consider equipment as part of that environment, part of the problem that the athlete will face.
And can you also talk about, and you mentioned it a little bit there where you talked about anxiety. Now, you and I have both had that surgery and come back from that. And so we understand some of the mind piece that very often gets left out of the rehab. Right now, I might be fine in that rehab facility where it's pretty limited and it's pretty straightforward. But then the sporting event or the real world event is a whole different ball game. Do you find that we often forget about the mental side of this reintegration and the importance of preparing the mind and the body for where they might have to go?
I think it's interesting because I think we discuss it, but I don't think we discuss it in the right context. Like we'll say things like, where you're at mentally, where you're at physically, almost as if like they're separate, right? As this, it's a lived experience here mentally, and then physically is separate from that. But we know that they're integrated. And so a lot of the times, we talk about an athlete having, confidence. And personally, I feel like if you adopt this approach, you allow them to become more confident, because nothing increases confidence more than doing the thing that you have to do, right? In a maybe a graded exposure type of way. So not the full right thing that could be overwhelming, right? But you do it in a little bit of a reduced, more scaled down way. That's going to give that athlete confidence because they realize, hey, I can do this. I'm not fragile, right? I know this is possible. And that's the thing that I noticed in myself as an athlete, is where you become so inundated with the physical. You become so inundated with how my body is moving. Is my knee going to be okay? right? It is because so much of the focus in the language is focused on internal, right? It's focused on what is my knee doing in space. Like, okay, as an example, like when I squat, I kind of make sure my knee doesn't come over my toes, right? And that creates even more anxiety when that athlete is now seeing for the first time an environment that looked like, what they faced previously. So I think really talking about mental, the mental side of things is important, but also it should be done in context. Like, say you do an activity with your athlete, you can ask them, well, how did that feel? Right? You can ask them these questions, and then they can clue you in to a little bit more of, whether that problem you designed was relevant, how they're feeling. You can kind of determine if it's too much of a cognitive load, if they're too stressed during this environment, scale it down. So I just think it needs to be discussed more in context rather than as two separate entities.
Absolutely. And I think it's so, I mean, I'm a huge advocate of imagery, performance enhancement imagery, been teaching it, incorporating it into training for well over 20 years. And I know some people within the law enforcement community that are using it as part of that reintegration process to help prepare the mind and the body. Now, you talked about confidence, and that confidence comes from that experience. And so this is a scaled approach where we're continually building that. But can you also talk about, so you talk about anti-fragility. So I think if there's a couple of ways, whether we use the term anti-fragility or we use the term resilience, but it's not about bouncing back. I'm never going to be the same as I was before. It's about moving through this experience and then becoming a new and ideally better version of myself down the road. Can you talk about the importance of that? That it's not about getting me back to where I was before. It's about how are we moving forward and moving through this experience?
Exactly. Yeah. That's, I mean, you said it perfectly. It's not about, again, becoming that old version of yourself. It's about, again, adapting to your new set of constraints. And there's so many ways that you can promote anti-fragility. You can promote it. Again, we'll talk about mindset. Here's a great way to tie in the mindset piece. If we're working with our athletes, we have to get them used to learning. And getting used to learning means getting used to messiness, which means getting used to failure. Right. And so when we talk about confidence and anti-fragility, right? If your athlete for the first time experiences a problem that doesn't go their way, are they going to shut down? Or are they going to say, no, that this is good, right? This is this is an opportunity for learning. So some of the best coaches that I know help curate that because they curate that mindset of reframing what it is to fail. Because if you don't fail in your practice, you're leaving that up to the real world. You're leaving that up to like you're just going to leave it to chance. That athlete is going to have the mental fortitude and the ability to kind of reframe that. So in a way, we're almost reframing adversity, in a sense, to where our athletes are hopefully not looking at as an opportunity to put their head down, to feel less than, but looking at it as a way to understand that, hey, I'm used to this. At Ignite, things aren't always pretty. At Ignite, not always going to have somebody telling me that this is the best thing ever, right? And so that way, when I get into a game, into competition, I'm used to this, and I'm not just going to collapse. I'm going to adapt, and I'm going to be stronger. I'm not just going to, crumble and put my head down.
Absolutely. And I like that. So I'm going to be talking to Marianne Davies, who I think
Yeah.
down the road, talk about training and learning in the ugly zone, which is important.
Mm-hmm.
And we talk a lot about that desirable difficulties that's coined by Robert Bjork from UCLA. And that, I talk about that we need to embrace the struggle, embrace the suck, look for the learning, look for the good, and be willing to dare to be great. So this is all part of the process here. So can you talk about now? When I reached out to you, I said, would you be willing to give some thought to, say, a law enforcement officer that they're coming back from this, say, a knee injury, and they want to get back, but they want to have the competence and confidence to be able to do the job, which is a whole wide range of things that they might face, all of which are going to happen without a warm up, without the ability to
Mm-hmm.
stretch and warm up beforehand. And so they might go from sitting in a car to an all out sprint followed by a fight. And so, what would be some of the things that you would be thinking about as a sport movement specialist if a law enforcement professional came to you and said, look, I'm in this rehab process, but I want to start thinking about being actually prepared to go back to the job because I don't want to get injured again?
I think, the first step would be to really understand what are the components of that job? Like, what is my client, my athlete, what do they actually have to do? I think that's where the first problem that people mess up is that they assume that they know, and then you don't actually ask. Like I've worked with sports that I'm not familiar with, and then I ask the athlete, send me some film. Let me look at what you're doing so I can try to better understand the demands of your sport or your activity. So that would be the first thing. When I think of law enforcement and some of the scenarios you sent me that you discussed, I think of the ultimate adaptable mindset and adaptable person, right? You have to have that sense of not always having a warm up, like you said. And I think what I would do is try to understand some of the constraints that are present in their environment. So, for example, we already touched on equipment. We touched on, I think we might have touched on fatigue. Like one of the things I would do is have them train and perform their whatever session I have while they're fatigued. I would probably like gas them out, for example, and then have them try to achieve proficiency under those settings. That would be one thing I would do. It would be a heavy dose of repetition without repetition. It could be as simple as doing a squat and changing up the load every time. Things like water bags can be very useful. Like kettlebells can be very useful because those are inherently have more variability. When it comes down to actually performing, if I was working in maybe the context of more of their skill, which is probably going to be more someone like you and in the field stuff, I would definitely make sure that I changed the problem up fairly frequently. Like I wouldn't necessarily expect a 10 out of 10, like we have to get 10 out of 10 right to solve this problem. I would expect a little bit of a lower level of completion to try to push that athlete to their challenge point. So I would make sure that if I saw that police officer getting too comfortable in solving this problem, if we were working on a certain task, I would make sure that I changed those constraints. I manipulated it so that way they could become adaptable to any set of constraints. So that would be where I would start. And it's funny you talk about the warm up. I was thinking about this as well. Varying up maybe when the session time is, varying up the time that they have to get prepared, I think is an underutilized thing because we always talk about, having this perfect, at least in strength conditioning, this perfect warm up. Everything's balanced. Like that's not always realistic. And I'll share a quick story. We were preparing an NFL player for the potential NFL player for the combine for his pro day, and obviously a pro day is pretty. It's bench press, right? It's not something that's highly variable. But what happened that we didn't necessarily account for, right? He had his bench warm up, right, and then he had, I think he was 6th on the list. Well, 4 other guys didn't bench because they just decided not to, right? That's an option. So then he had to be up right away and ready to go. And looking back on that experience, I don't think we prepared him enough to do that. Right? What do you do when you don't have a chance to do your warm up? And so that's kind of informed my mindset when it comes to making sure an athlete can perform under any conditions, warm up or not. Like that's the expectation of the job. Obviously, you want to have safety. You don't want to maybe just have them do it like first week, post-op, go ahead and just go break into a sprint. But if that's the case, then I would probably train under those conditions.
Yeah, that's interesting that you talk about the fatigue because again, it's is this the first half an hour of the first shift in a string of shifts, or is this my 5th consecutive night shift and I've been getting 4 hours of sleep a night because I've had court every morning and I had a foot chase earlier in the shift, and so I'm already fatigued from the lack of sleep, and now we're in, because that's the other challenge, right, is the lighting conditions. So we're going, sometimes if I'm working day shift, it might be full light, but day shift, part of my shift is going to be, certain times a year in complete darkness and other times in full light. People that work night shift are dealing with that on a regular basis. Heat, the amount of clothing. So is that part of it, to start to think about all of these tasks that they might have to perform, and then how can we slowly start to do things that would be realistic, a representation of that, and then build on those as we go?
Absolutely. And I think that's you laid it out perfectly, because you don't necessarily want to throw everything, the kitchen sink, and now each athlete is also different. That's also worth mentioning. Certain athletes you can see that can handle a little bit more variability. Like at the same time, when I'm promoting variability, if you see that your athlete is failing every time, then you probably need to scale it down. Then you do need to reduce the complexity, reduce some variability, because that isn't a good thing. But I think adding slowly, adding in layers, as I like to say, adding in a layer here, adding in a layer there. And the tricky part for people, I think, is that they want a cookbook of add this and that and that. There really isn't. And that's where the coaching comes in, right? That's where coaching and seeing and understanding your athlete. Maybe you can add this week. Okay, that was too much. Well, let me back off. Let me get their feedback. Taking that athlete-centered approach, asking them for their input, right? They're the one living and breathing in that environment, versus just superimposing this template onto them. I think that's really important.
So talk more about some of that, because I know you've talked before about the physio part, or if I'm going to the gym and working with a personal trainer, and historically we've done this in all of our law enforcement training, is we want to replicate perfect technique. And so we're doing repetition after repetition as opposed to repetition without repetition. So can you talk about how you balance that? So they might be coming to you and somebody has told them you need to be very internally focused, and all these cues that I get from my physio are internal. And yet when I'm out in the world, the cues I'm feeding off are external. Can you talk about how you adapt some of that and how you get people on board with thinking differently about some of these tasks?
Absolutely. I think, when it comes to the internal language, internal cues, I think, again, at the beginning of a rehab, I think a protocol, I think there's a place for that. But as they transition into more of their environment, it needs to be more externally driven, right? Perception is going to drive movement. So they need to be able to, perceive what they're going to be doing in order to organize their movements. I think that's really important. And getting that athlete away from that, we've had athletes come in and you can tell when they're overly constrained on the internal because they're just looking down at their feet. They're warming up, looking down at their feet. And I don't want that. I want them to be aware. I want them to be present. I want them to see what's available to them. And I think really, as we integrate more of these layers of the environment and really integrate more repetition without repetition, we need to understand that technique has a bandwidth, right? Technique has a bandwidth, right? I'm not saying that things should look completely different, but people will go about solving the same problem, performing something like certain tasks, and they're going to look a little bit different. We need to be okay with that because that athlete might solve the problem that way. And as long as it's an effective and efficient solution for them, then that's okay. It's not that we're saying you can't ever have any technique. It's that there's a bandwidth and we need to be willing to work with that athlete to guide them toward what works for them. The problem with just practicing the perfect thing over and over again is that what happens when that perfect thing isn't available for you to utilize, or when that problem changes slightly. And so what you do is you create this really reliable technique that you can only utilize in that situation, rather than several forms of this technique that you can utilize in any situation. So that's where the danger comes about sticking solely to perfect technique. The other issue is that with technical models, like we see this, for example, in a lot of times in sport, when it comes to like linear speed, a lot of the models are based off of, like track. We have to understand that track and field is different than like American football, right? Than team sports. And so we take this model that doesn't fit. So sometimes we can take these models that, I'm not sure who created them or where they come from, but we superimpose them that did not necessarily fit with that athlete.
Absolutely. And again, when you talk about the importance of repetition without repetition, is the reality for law enforcement professionals is they've never dealt with the same call twice. Every single situation is different. And unlike sports, there's not a there's a set of rules for us, but not necessarily for the person we're dealing with. There's no officials there. And the conditions are radically different. So for you, you might be dealing with something, or say officers with Chandler Police Department, in June or July, they're going to be dealing with situations where they're out in 115-degree heat in the middle of the day. Whereas for other people in different parts of North America, they might be dealing in conditions where it's minus 30, minus 40, and they're wearing so much clothing that they can't even get to any of their equipment. At what point would you start to integrate some of the equipment, like the boots, the footwear that they wear on duty, the duty belt, and some of the other equipment into some of the training that they're doing? Because again, that's going to shift my movement capabilities. It's going to shift a lot of different elements.
Honestly, I would go as early as possible. I think there are, for certain tasks, for sure, you could have them use boots, you can use belts. There's nothing wrong with that. And I think if anything, that's going to get them feeling more whole again. And what I mean by that is, when you're an injured athlete, you could probably understand this as well. When you're an injured athlete and you're removed from your environment, from what you're born, what you love to do,
yep,
there's something that is really jarring about that. And that first time when you hold a football again, when you put on the boots again, maybe when you have your belt on with all your equipment on, the first time you do that, you start to understand that, like, yeah, this is getting me back to my sport. Like, you start to become whole again, as I said earlier. So I would start, honestly, as soon as possible. I could see a scenario where, a police officer, if you're working on even a gym exercise, there's no reason why they couldn't do it in their boots. There's no reason why they couldn't feel what stability feels like in those boots again versus in a pair of Nikes, because they're not going to wear Nikes on the job. So why would I not at least have them feel what that feels like again?
absolutely. Now, we talked before about training with another person, with an opponent. I think there's a couple of pieces of that. Now, number one, it's whoever is serving as the opponent needs to keep their ego in check, right? So that when you're working with an athlete, you're not trying to make them look stupid or crush them or beat them. You're going to increase the level of that competition as you go, but you need to keep your ego in check as part of that. And for us, it seems to me that where we're building to is that we can create a simulation where the role player is wearing padded equipment so that I can actually execute strikes at significant speed and power and do those things. They can attack me. But in the early stages, we would be working on, say, touch drill, where I might just be doing light touch, but you are going to react as if it's a full speed and power, so that I learn to that perception action coupling. Is that part of it, is making sure that everybody, that it's not just the person who's rehabbing, but everybody who's playing that other person understands their role in this process as well?
Absolutely. And that's where, as a coach, you can kind of guide the intentions of the opponent. You could simply tell them explicitly, hey, what I want you to do is get in their way. And that's a different task than I want you to wrap them up. I want you, if you're using football, for example,
right?
Or you can constrain the task to reduce velocity. Like, we'll do, again, like I mentioned earlier, we'll do, like a tag drills and things like that, tag activities. And instead of having them move all around, we'll say, hey, you have to lock your feet in place. So that's going to constrain a little bit of the power they can gather. They can't really load up, right? We might say you can only tap the shoulder, so there's no head contact. I know you've spoken with like Scott and Greg, and they're really good at doing those type of things. So even a beginner or someone maybe coming off of an injury can still have a live movement problems. I think the issue becomes is when we reduce something so much that it no longer looks like the thing, right? We reduce a task, and then it does not have any, the fancy word would be action fidelity, but it doesn't look and feel and act like the sport or the task that the athlete is doing. There are ways to reduce it, to guide intentions of the opponent, or to even get in there yourself as a coach to make sure that it looks, feels, and acts like the sport or the task that the athlete is doing, but it is still safe. The velocities are reduced, power is reduced. It's still going to give that athlete that sense of being a real, scenario without necessarily the risk or the danger.
Absolutely. Now, how do you integrate the athletes who you're working with who are rehabbing from an injury with the other athletes at your facility? So you work with athletes from a wide range of sports. I think you said predominantly American football, baseball, and volleyball.
Mhm.
So how do you integrate that athlete so that they are starting to do some things as they progress with other people in some of the training that you're doing with the groups?
Yeah, that's a great question because it's not always easy. One of the things that we do in our warm up, like if you come and were to watch a session, our warm up doesn't look like your typical warm up.
Right.
Our warm up isn't, knee hugs, side shuffles, karaoke's. We try to include representative design, perception, and action right into our warm ups at a lower level. So we might start out in some sort of rep without rep squat for everybody. Well, that's great. That's what our athlete needs. So I might just pay special attention to the athlete that's coming off of an injury and really closely watch them and maybe guide them to say, hey, I want you to go nice and slow, nice and easy, and explore different ranges of motion. Because the other thing that happens with an injury, right, degrees of freedom or range of motion gets restricted. And I need them to open that up and feel what it feels like to move your hip like that, for your shoulder to move like that. So that would be like an example. Then that next part of the warm up might be something where there's a little bit of mirroring. So either I might jump in or I may ask one of our senior athletes, hey, I want you to go nice and easy with Brian here as they warm up. And then I might pull them for the rest of the activity as we carry on, and they might do some other exercises on their own. So they're still getting some relevant movement problems. And just like everybody is every day, they're getting something that's relevant, right? Even if they come in and it's once a week, I want to make sure that they see something that's alive. I don't ever want them to come in here and waste a session. So I might pull them from that point on. So that's the great part about the way we do it, is that every day they're going to see something that is kind of scaling in complexity anyway. So I might just remove them and have them do some stuff on the side with me, or, we might adjust if we're doing a speed-based task where they have to sprint and somebody is chasing after them, I may alter that. I may have them I'll kind of run halfway, or I may not even have them be chased yet, because that might be a little bit too much. So those are just some examples of what we might do to integrate them.
Now, we've been talking about rehab, but it seems to me that the prehab is an important piece of this as well. That if we were to train this way on a regular basis, it would serve to protect us in some way from being injured. That, again, what we do, and we do this a lot in law enforcement, is the weight room, or the typical weight room training, and some of the defensive tactics is very structured. You do A, and then you do B, and then you do C. But that none of that is reflective of the real world. Do we need to start thinking from a prehab perspective, from a prevention perspective, that if we train this way on a regular basis, train in environments that are representative of what we're going to be faced with, it's going to better prevent some of these injuries potentially?
Absolutely. I firmly believe in that, because I feel like we look at injury as just a biomechanics, a anatomical issue. We talk about, degrees of freedom, right? How well can my foot, my ankle, how well can I move in space in many different ways? That's important. But what we don't talk about is perceptual, right? Cognitive degrees of freedom. What am I seeing? What am I seeing? Have I seen many different scenarios so that I am prepared for that, right? Inherently, with repetition without repetition, you see a variety of movement problems, right? So that means that if you see that in competition, isn't the first time you've seen it when you're fatigued, when the field conditions are bad, when you didn't sleep because of finals, and all these factors are against you, and that you're ripe for injury. Now, I should say, we can't completely prevent it, but training in a way that creates a more robust athlete where they face more movement problems will reduce injury risk, I believe. There's actually research that had recently come out, I believe it's from the last couple of years, about variability, training in a more variable way, reducing injury markers for ACL in a prehab standpoint. This was with youth soccer players, I believe, but there are starting to be an emerging body of research that's saying if you train with more variability, right, you can likely reduce risk factors for injury. So I think just viewing it more than just, motor system, muscles, bones, joints. We know that the human movement system is so much bigger than that. And if we expose them to a variety of movement problems, they're likely going to be more robust. They're likely going to stay injured, avoid injury longer.
Now, do we also need to be cautious about getting about the allure of things like the NFL combine, where it's all about bench press, it's about vertical leap, it's about the 40-yard dash, it's about these things that none of which are representative of the game and are not necessarily. I mean, I think now the NFL Players Association has come out and pushing to do away with the combine. But you hear people in the NFL say, well, you know what, Jerry Rice sucked at sprinting speed in the combine, but the dude had game speed.
Mm-hmm.
Do we need to be cautious about the allure of some of those things where it looks really good, but it really doesn't have necessarily an application, things like bench press and those things to the real world environment?
Exactly. We need to be careful because we tend to look at tools. As I say, we don't look at who's wielding the tools. We look at tools. And I think we've all seen, if we played sports, we've all seen a friend or a teammate who is amazing, who jumps high, like volleyball, they touch 10 feet, can't hit the ball accurately. We've seen a person who runs fast, is the fastest, can't avoid being tackled. Why can this person who's slower keep up with them? Well, that's because our movements are tied to perception and action. That volleyball player, that outside hitter who's getting set, isn't just hitting. You see these things where you have a ball tied up and they just hit the ball that's suspended in the air. That's well and good, but that ball is going to be moving. So they have to couple their movements to setting the ball, right? Their mechanics, and time their jump and hit it at the peak of their jump. Oh, and then avoid getting blocked. So seeing where the middle of the blockers are, for example, you see this in Major League Baseball. They talk about tools. He's a 5-tool player. What does that actually mean? Does he hit for average or not? Because his swings looks good in batting practice, like that doesn't mean that's going to translate. I mean, you can see, there's the NFL combine numbers. You can look them up for yourself. How many of those players do people actually recognize? The top of the 3-cone and the pro agility, they didn't have great careers, a lot of them. And that's because we assume that that's automatically going to transfer, running in underclothes, in an environment that's completely closed where there's no decision making. We assume that's going to transfer. So it is definitely dangerous and it's easy to fall in love with numbers, but we have to be able to see how that athlete is wielding those tools, not just the tools themselves.
Absolutely. And again, how they're wielding those tools within the contextual environment that they're going to have to function in.
Absolutely.
Which is because we've all seen that people that look pretty spectacular, but they can't perform in the real world environment. So talk a little bit about Ignite Performance and what you do there in your facility for people that are in the greater Phoenix area. And then talk a little bit about the Tactical Athlete podcast.
So when it comes to Ignite, we work across time scales. We work across youth athletes all the way to pro athletes, but specializing in high school athletes. For us, we really believe in holistic long-term athletic development. I've talked a little bit about my past as an athlete, and I realized there was a lot of things that I didn't do well. Like there's a lot of things that, let's put it this way, I was fragile, right? I had a lot of injuries, confidence was tanked, didn't have the right nutrition, didn't really have the right mindset in order to get the best out of my athletic career. And so we want to provide the opportunity for those athletes to get the best out of that. And we understand that it extends like way beyond just lifting weights and running fast. So we try to take that approach, whether that comes from strength training with movement. We understand, right? It goes far beyond looking at speed ladders and looking pretty, cutting out against a cone. We understand that that approach is what really is going to lead to hopefully a long career. We want to make sure that they just don't have success right away. We want to see them have success long after they're done seeing us. So that's the approach we take with Ignite. We want to make sure that those athletes are getting the care essentially that we didn't get. We typically work, again, as you mentioned, with sports, American football, baseball, volleyball, but we do work with all sports. We want to make sure that we still have some level of specificity towards each sport. It's not like everybody's just coming in and doing random stuff. But at the same time, understanding that there are certain things that our athletes need. There are commonalities. There's commonalities that we know youth athletes need. We certain things we know college athletes need, pro athletes, right? We still try to do that under the umbrella of understanding that each athlete is unique.
And I love that you guys have evolved, and you're very honest about that. And when you talk about your evolution, and too many people are just going to do what was done when they were an athlete and do what they were taught at the basic courses, and you guys are continue to look at, is there a better way? What can we do? What can we learn? How can we change? And how can we best prepare these people? And I apologize that I misnamed your podcast. It's the Athlete Blueprint podcast. But just before you talk about that, it seems to me that when I was coaching youth sports, when my two boys were growing up, is the biggest challenge with youth sports. I was always of the opinion youth sports could be a lot of fun if it wasn't for parents. Do you find that you have a tough time sometimes with parents where you're doing something radically different from what they've seen from other coaches and other places, and that some of them might wonder why you're not doing the historic things?
Absolutely. But what I'm curious, what sports did you coach?
Football, soccer, basketball.
Okay. So a little bit all over the place. Yes.
Yep.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So there's this expectation that people know what training looks like because it's been what we see for years, and unfortunately, people rarely question what they're doing. People rarely question whether this is effective. Are my athletes succeeding in spite of me or because of me? And so a lot of times it's just passed on. It's inherited. So when I first started training, I would do your typical, ladder drills. I would do ladder drills. I would do what everybody else is doing. Because why? Because that's what I did. Because I didn't investigate further whether I thought this was working or whether I thought this was actually helping. And I noticed certain things in training sessions and in games. I'm like, man, I don't see a change. I don't see my athletes actually getting really better, at least the way I thought they were. And so that's one of the reasons why, I started investigating what I was doing, just understanding like maybe I don't have all the answers. I never thought I did, but I thought I was doing a pretty good job. And it's a humbling experience. So just to anyone listening to this, and maybe they're in the middle of transitioning, you have to be able to deal with that understanding that what you're doing, it's not like it was all bad, but there's a better way. And if at the end of the day, it's to serve your athletes, and that's all that matters. To answer the question about parents, I mean, 100%, like a lot of the times parents want technique. They want things that look really good, right? Because that's the way they understand sports to be. And so I've even had athletes or parents of athletes, say stuff like, well, my kid they've gotten faster. They're getting more playing time. The fastest on the team, but hey, can you look at their running form? It just looks a little sloppy to me. And so I'm like, wait, you just said all these things about how they're succeeding in their sport, and now you want me to just work on the running form? So there's that. I think another aspect of parents, any parents that are listening to this understand, is that your athlete is growing, especially if they're younger. They're growing. So we forget what that's like. We forget what that's like to learn something new. Yeah. And we forget what that's like to physically actually grow. So that athlete that's 5'8" and now is 6'1" over summer, going to look totally different, right? They have to adapt to their individual, the new set of constraints. So having the dialogue with parents, I think, is really important to try to get ahead of it and try to help them understand like what we're doing. Like at the end of the day, we're just trying to make your athlete better. And this is how we do it. It's more fun. Our kids love it. One of the KPIs that I have for our activity design is our kids smiling. When they say, hey, can we keep playing or do we have to stop? Oh, let's go. Let's keep riding with it. So that's important for us. And it definitely is an extra layer, an extra constraint for us. When we look at what the parents are thinking, we have a big window so they can see everything that's going on. It's like an open kitchen at a restaurant. They can see. So something's weird, looks weird to them. Something's messy to them. We have to understand what they might be thinking. So, we just try to get ahead of that. And then I believe you had asked about the podcast.
Yeah, just before we get into the podcast, there's
Mhm.
two things I just want to reinforce that you said. So I think we need to make sure that we have that conversation with our recruits, that it's not necessarily with their parents, but with the recruits, that this, if we're adopting this model, is that this is going to be different from every other training experience that they've
Mhm.
had. But I think the other piece is the humility and the vulnerability to keep looking for a better way. And there's a quote from Maya Angelou, and I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but it basically says, do the best you can with what you know, but when you know better, do better. So I think we need to have the humility and the vulnerability to be continually looking for what is a better way. And then once we know better, we need to do better. We can't just keep saying, well, it's easier to hold on to the old way. So talk about the Athlete Blueprint podcast, what the kind of the format is, what your overall goal and mission is, and how people can follow you on that.
Could I add one comment to what you
Absolutely.
said?
Yep.
Yeah, and I think because what you're saying is so important, and I just want to really emphasize the fact that like anybody who's in this space, we rarely just ended up there. We didn't just show up one day. Like I did a lot of bad stuff before I did good stuff. I did a lot of things that I look back and cringe. And I like talking about it because I think it's kind of a thing that gets swept under the rug. We try to portray ourselves as coaches as having all the answers and being perfect.
Yep.
And no one ever wants to talk about the stuff that they didn't do well. And I think that's what keeps a lot of people from making the switch and understanding that it's okay to not be 100% finished product. And I just think that's really important to emphasize to anybody who's training police officers or any other coaches who are listening to this. It's okay to have moments where you're not perfect.
Yep.
And one thing that I've been thinking about lately is just if we're going to demand adaptability or ask adaptability, if we're going to ask openness of our athletes, don't we have to ask that of ourselves? And
Absolutely.
we should be the example. But anyway, sorry, just wanted to say that.
No, that's a great point.
And so it's the Athlete Blueprint podcast. So we mainly focus a lot of our topics on skill acquisition, on how we can make our athletes more skillful, really investigating it. And for me, it's really been a passion project. It's been an opportunity to talk with people such as yourself, other great practitioners, coaches. We also do some other things with sports psychology and some nutrition, but I used it selfishly, honestly, as a way to get better as a coach. And it's helped, and it's been an incredible experience. The format is usually long format interviews, such as this one, or it's shorter episodes that I'll try to do, deep dives on topics that I think need to be elucidated a little bit more. Like I did one on 3 ways to reduce task complexity, what it means to be skillful. So things like that I feel like coaches may be struggling with, or that I'm struggling with or have in the past. So that's the typical format. It's available on all podcast platforms. Just released episode 50, and it's been a really fun ride. It's helped me grow, and I hope it's helped people in the community grow as well.
Well, I know it's made a huge contribution, and you have a great interview style, and it's something that I know people would really enjoy listening to. So, how can they follow you? How can they find out more about Ignite? Obviously, if they just search for the Athlete Blueprint podcast, they can find that website as well. But you can talk about that website, and then I think you guys are active on social media, on Instagram, and some of the other social media things that old people like myself may not be familiar with. But so, talk about how people can follow you or find out more about what you're doing as well.
Yeah. So at Ignite, igniteperformance.net is the website. Someone had already stolen the .com. I don't know who, but you know how that goes. But
Yep.
You can find us there. We're on all the social media platforms. Instagram, we're a lot probably more active on. It's _Ignite Performance _. We're also on Twitter. Personally, I'm on Twitter and all those platforms as well. If you look for the Coach Jav, either on Twitter or Instagram. I'm even on Facebook, LinkedIn from time to time. And another way, honestly, is just sending a message, just like, we connected and having a conversation. I'm always happy to have a conversation with people that are genuinely interested in learning more about these ideas and learning to grow as coaches. And as far as the podcast goes, if you look at Athlete Blueprint Podcasts and in any of your podcast providers, there is a website as well called the athleteblueprintpodcast.com. Feel free to check it out. I love hearing from new people. Oftentimes that's how I get guests, is I kind of hear about other people who are into this space and who might provide some valuable information for the audience. So always open to connect.
Excellent. And people can go to Emergent Movement website and under the products, go to the 2021 the Sport Movement Skill Conference. You can buy access to all 4 days, and Javi's presentation was on day 4. Great content, and you'll see a bunch of videos where he shows some of the things that he talked about in this interview. So Javi, I want to thank you. I want to thank you for making time for out of your very busy schedule to do the interview. But more importantly, I want to thank you for all the contributions that you have made and continue to make to this field, being very open, sharing your information on social media and through the podcast, because you're making a significant difference in helping people that are looking at advancing some of these and changing the way that we think about some of these critical areas. So for everything that you have done, everything you continue to do, thank you so much for your passion and your contributions and your commitment.
Thanks, Brian. I appreciate it. This is a lot of fun, man. I really appreciate you having me on.
Well, it's certainly my pleasure. And so to the members of the Excellence Training Academy community, as always, I encourage you to let the information that Javi shared, and he shared a lot of great information. Let that information simmer, percolate overnight, and then be intentional. Sit down tomorrow, write out your greatest takeaways, and then write out your action steps. What actions are you going to take to put this into motion in your life and in your training and share it with other people? And as always, to the members of the Excellence Training Academy community, I thank you for your commitment to excellence both in and through training. Always continue to train hard, train smart, train with passion and purpose, and always be willing to dare to be great.